Hey friends, what's up? And welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Gimel, Daf 13 of Masechta Taanis. Friends, who could tell me what Daf 13 talks about? Do you guys like when I do that? Yeah, I don't know. One second. Oh, alright. There it is. Okay. Oh gosh. Alright. Let's move on. Fine. Friends, what is today's daf talk about? Today's daf talks about bathing on fast days. So that's really the subject of today's daf. Friends, let us jump in. We're on daf Yud Gimel, 4 lines into the page. We're gonna be stopping a little bit early today, so I imagine today's probably gonna be a shorter daf. Isn't really a good place to stop, kind of until like halfway till down the next amud, and I don't know, whatever it is. I don't know if I'm making the right decision or the wrong decision, but we're not going to get we're going to get about halfway through Yud Gimel and base day, then we're going to stop. I have a feeling that tomorrow's daf is not going to be one of the shorter ones, but today will. So there's that. So anyways, friends, 4 lines into the page on daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Rafim bar Papa Amar Rav Chizda, says Rafim bar Papa in the name of Rav Chizda, Koshu Mishum Avel, that whenever there's a fast day, that we're fasting out of mourning. So Kigon, for example, Tisha B'Av, they were mourning the destruction of the temple. The Ovel, right? Or obviously a fellow who's actually in mourning. So that's, about like a fellow who's mourning is definitely out of concern for mourning. So in that case, whether it's like a fast day like Tisha B'Av, where we're fasting because we're mourning, or whether you're actually mourning, so then you're not allowed to bathe in hot water or in cold water. Kolshu mishum tainug. Now, if there's a fast day that we're fasting that it's not out of mourning per se, but we just don't want to be getting any hana, for example, Taanis Esther, not mourning, but it's a day that we don't get pleasure. So it could go on Taanis Tzibur, for example, if you have a Taanis Tzibur, okay, so maybe there isn't rain or something. We're not mourning anything, but we definitely don't want to be getting pleasure. We're trying to get the Eibishter to pain ourselves so that the Eibishter will give us rain. So B'chaman also B'toni Mutter. So in those cases, you're certainly not allowed to bathe in hot water, because that would be a tainug, that would be an enjoyment. But B'tzonin Mutter, you'd be allowed to bathe in cold water. Amar Vidi Baravin. Says Ravidi Baravin Afonu Nami Tanina. Interestingly, we can also learn this from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah had said at the end of the day yesterday that on these sort of next level fast days, so you're not allowed to right. So already you stop eating already the night before, and you don't bathe, you don't put on oils, things like that. So, and we lock the bathhouses. Now, what kind of water do they have in bathhouses? Hot water. So Avida Baravin wants to say that from the fact that the Mishnah Dafka says that we lock the bathhouses where there's hot water, implying that cold water would taka be okay. But fact Abaye, Abaye says Abaye to Avida Baravin, Vibitzonen Osir Sochun Esanairis Mibaile the Misneh. So Abaye says, I don't understand why that's necessarily such a good proof. And let's say on these Taanis Tziburs, in addition to being forbidden from using hot water, you're also not allowed to use cold water. What should the Mishnah say? And they dried up all the rivers, Kilu? Like, that's crazy. Meaning, what the fact that we didn't mention anything about cold water isn't a proof that you're allowed to bathe in cold water, right? Let's see, right? That's not a proof that you are allowed to bathe in cold water. Because even if you weren't allowed to bathe in cold water, like, what are you gonna do? Stop up the river? Like, build a dam? So, Rav Shisha Beder Avidi, Abba Hachi Kashale. So, Rabbi Bar Avin's son, Rav Shisha, so he comes to explain his father, right? So he says, right? So it says Rav Shishi Bar Ida, Abba Hachi Kashale. This is what my father was essentially asking and answering. Michdei Tnan also Berchitza. The Mishnah had already said that on these fast days, you're not allowed to wash, you're not allowed to bathe. So memele, if it says that you're not allowed to wash, you're not allowed to bathe, so memele, full stop. cold water, hot water, any water, you're not allowed to bathe, whether it's hot, whether it's cold. So why did then the Mishnah need to specify that we lock the bathhouses? I mean, you're not allowed to, if in fact you weren't allowed to bathe, whether in hot, whether in cold, so just say, don't bathe, and that's that. Why mention anything about the bathhouses? Why Davka mention the bathhouses? It must be that what the Mishnah is saying, that Becham and Osir Bitzonein Mutter. What it's saying is that yes, we lock the bathhouses, that what it's saying is that in hot water you're not allowed to bathe, but in cold water you are. And that's talking about Davka on a public fast day. So we see that public fast days, which are about Tainug, which are about refraining from enjoyment. So in those cases, you are allowed to bathe in cold water. So let's say that this taka supports Rav Bar Papa, who says that when it comes to mourning, right? So it said two things. Right, he said that when it comes to fast days that are, because we don't want you getting pleasure, so then you are allowed to bathe in cold water. And when it comes to things like Tisha B'Av, which is out of mourning, so then you're not allowed to bathe in cold water or hot water. Right, so hot water or cold water. So let's say that the following supports this assertion: that anybody who needs to go to the mikveh can go to the mikveh in their normal fashion. Bein b'Tisha B'Av, bein b'Yom Kippurim. Whether it's on Tisha B'Av, whether it's on Yom Kippur, you go to the mikveh. B'mai. Now, great, givaldig. So what kind of water are they going to the mikveh in? Ileiman b'chamin. If you're saying that they're going to the mikveh in hot water, tfil b'chamin mi'ika. Shuvininu. How can you go to the mikveh in hot water? What, you can go to the bathhouse? The bathhouse, the water is ma'im she'uvin. They're collected water. Right, and it has to be rainwater. So elalav bitzonin. Rather, it must be saying that in cold water, that in cold mikveh water, on Tisha B'Av, which is a fast that's out of mourning, you're allowed to go to the mikveh in cold water. V'chai b'tfilos in ishachrina lo, and specifically people who need to go to the mikveh can go to the mikveh in cold water, but any other people would not be allowed to bathe themselves in cold water. So we see, like Rav Bar Papa saying the name of Rav Chizda, that on fast days that we have a concern for mourning, you are not allowed to bathe in cold water. So Amar of Chana Bar Katina, lo nitzcha el l'chami tiveria. So it says of Chana Bar Katina, lav dafka, you could theoretically argue that even on fast days that are out of concern for mourning, you would be allowed to bathe in cold water. Just that, so what's the situation where specifically people who need to go to the mikvah are entitled to go to the mikvah? So it could be talking about that they're allowed in hot water in the Chami Tiveria, in the hot springs of Tiveria. That whereas other people would not be allowed to go there because it's a fast day, but people who need to go to the mikvah can go to the Chami Tiveria, but everybody can go to cold water. That's fine. If that's the case, Ema Seifa. But one second, if that's the case, that basically anybody can go to the mikveh and could bathe in cold water. Well, if we continue reading in that brisa, it says, Amr b'chanina skana kohanim. It says, b'chanina skana kohanim. Don't worry, we're not going to get into Tumah and Tyre, like we did in Masechta Psachim. Kidayu beis elukenu la'abid olav tvila pamachas bashana. The Reb Chanina skana kohanim responds and says, meh, what do you mean? Right, meaning the Tanakama had said anybody who needs to go to the mikveh can go to the mikveh on Tisha B'Av. To which Reb Chanina Skana Kohanim, he responds and says, I think that the Beis HaMikdash is important enough that you can miss going to the mikveh one day a year. Now, the Amr Bitzonin Mutter, Yirchatz Bitzonin. Now, if it's true that on Tisha B'Av anybody could just bathe in cold water, so then what's he saying? Kilu, Reb Chanina Skana Kohanim seems to be responding and saying, no, because it's Tisha B'Av, it's okay, just don't go into the water for one day. But if we're saying, well, anybody could really just go into cold water anyways, then what's he really saying? He's saying, he's making a macha. He's saying, what do you mean? The Beis HaMikdash is important enough that you can give up on going to the mikveh one day a year. While at the same time, anybody could just go in cold water. So you can always just go in cold water anyways. So like, meaning if you say that by these people going to the mikvah, they're davka allowed to go in cold water, nobody else can do anything. To which Chanina Skan and the Kohanim say no, just like nobody can go into cold water, and certainly not hot water. Also, these people, when you go to the mikvah, cannot even go into cold water. Nobody is immersing in water on Tisha B'Av out of respect and out of mourning for the temple. Nobody is going into water. I don't care who you are or what your mikvah certain circumstances and needs are. Not happening. However, if we say, well, anybody can go into the cold water, then what's Reb Chanina Skan Kohanim getting so excited about and responding and saying, no, these people can not go to the mikvah in hot water, but anybody can go in cold water anyway, so it's not like so extreme. So, the Amr B'tzonin Mutter Yirchaz B'tzonin, so Amr Papa Ba'asad L'Shchiach Tzonin. Well, it could be talking about that a place where there is no cold water. There's only the Chamei Tveria, there's only hot water. So maybe that's what's happening. It's like, it's the Chamei Tveria. Really, anybody could go and wash themselves in cold water, arguably. And we're saying that people who need to go to the mikvah are allowed to even go in hot water. And we're talking about a place where there is no cold water available. And Chanina Skan Kohanim is responding and saying, no, these people shouldn't be going to the mikvah that day. What about they could just go in cold water? Well, there is no cold water available. All right, Seder. Fine. So I guess it's not definitive that it's not definitive that they can only go to the mikveh in that nobody is allowed to bathe in cold water on these communal on these fast days out of mourning, right? Meaning Rav Bar Papa had said in the name of Chizda that on a fast day that's out of mourning, you're not allowed to bathe in hot water or cold water. But that might not necessarily be the case. We could argue that maybe you actually could argue that you could bathe in cold water even on the fast days. All right, Tashma, come in here. Oh, okay. So when they say that you're not allowed to do malacha work on these sort of Taanis tziburs, on these communal fast days, that's only during the day. Don't do work during the day. You're allowed to do work at night. All right. Also, when they said that you're not allowed to wear leather shoes, that's specifically in the city. But if you're traveling, you're allowed to wear leather shoes. All right. So how do you do this? Okay, when you're traveling, you put on your shoes. When you get into the city, you take them off. Interesting. And when they said that you're not allowed to bathe, that is your entire body. But you're allowed to wash your face, your hands, and your feet. Okay, fine. So we're saying that on a fast day, on a communal fast day, on a public fast day, so when we say that you're not allowed to bathe, that's specifically your entire body, but you're allowed to bathe your face, your hands, and your legs, and your feet. We find the same thing by a person who's excommunicated as well as by a mourner. Oh, so now we're already getting to mourning territory. And we're saying that you're allowed to wash your hands, your face, and your legs. My lav akulu uvamayaskinun. So mistama, we're saying that when we apply the sort of these halachis by a fast day, by a communal fast day, also to a mourner, so it's talking about all three things. It's talking about work, it's talking about wearing shoes, and it's talking about bathing. And and if we're saying that when we say you're allowed to wash your face, your hands, and your feet, it's with hot water, panav yadav v'raglav misharu, but is a mourner allowed to wash his hands, feet, and face with warm water? A mourner is not even allowed to put his finger in hot water. So rather it must be that we're talking about even cold water. And we're saying that, right, with Afka saying cold water, that certain, if we're saying that by a communal fast day, and now we're saying also by a mourner, you're allowed to wash your face, your hands, and your feet. Well, clearly that's not hot water, because an Avel, a mourner, is not allowed to put even his finger into hot water. So we must be talking about cold water. That it's saying that that you're allowed to wash your face, your hands, and your feet in cold water, but not your entire body. So it would sound like on a fast day, you're adavka not allowed to wash in cold water, only your face, your hands, and your feet. So the Gemara says, Lo, olam bechamin, really it is talking about hot water. Saying that, right, you can argue that in cold water on a fast day, you're allowed to bathe in cold water, there's no question about that. And you're even allowed to wash your hands, your feet, and your face in hot water as well. Just not your whole body. But what about the fact that we said, yes, but we find the same thing also by somebody who's excommunicated as well by a mourner? And by a mourner, certainly you're not allowed to wash your hands, face, and feet with hot water. So asha'arakoi. So the comparison, the connection to the mourner, the excommunicated person, and the excommunicated person is specifically by the shoes and by the work, but not by the washing. Because when it comes to washing, by Taanis tzibur, you're allowed to wash your face, hands, and feet in hot water, but a mourner is not allowed to do that. Okay, so we want to make the argument that when it comes to a public fast day, you are allowed to wash your whole body in cold water. Tashma, come in here. Damar Reb Abba Kohen. Oh, says Reb Abba Kohen mishum Reb Yossi Kohen. Name Reb Yossi Kohen. All right. Now I don't think that this is the Reb Yossi Kohen who was the student of Reb Yochanan ben Zakkai, because I think that these are Amoraim, I think. Anyways, Maisu Mesu Banav Reb Yossi ben Reb Chanina. So there was a story that the children of Reb Yossi ben Chanina passed away. V'achaz b'tzonin kol shiva, and he washed in cold water during the 7 days of mourning, during Shiva. So we see that they were mourning, and he was in mourning, and he was washing in cold water. Now Rafim Bar Papa said in the name of Chizda that a mourner is not allowed to wash, certainly not in hot water, not even in cold water. But we see that Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina was washing in cold water during Shiva. So the Gemara answers, Hasam over there, Kishet Chafu Avelav Hava. That was talking about where it says that his multiple children passed away, and it was one after the other. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Chafu Avelav, that if a fellow is in mourning consecutively, so not just for 1 week, but one after the other, Ze'achar Zeh, one after the other, if his hair is just getting too heavy, Mekil Basar, he could lighten it up with a razor. He could launder his clothing in water. Amr of Chizda says of Chizda Basar, Avalop Misparayim. Yes, he could cut his hair with a razor, but not use scissors. He could wash his clothing in water, but he shouldn't use any, like kind of detergent kind of things. Omar Rav, says Rav, okay, fine. So we wanted to say that maybe from there a mourner is allowed to wash in cold water, as we saw by Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina, but we said that maybe that was Dafka, a unique situation, because he was in mourning one time after the other. Omar Rav, says Rav, Avel muter lechotz bitzonin kol shiva. So says Rav that a mourner is permitted to bathe in cold water, kol shiva. Wow. So says Rav that a mourner is taka allowed to bathe in cold water. Just like a mourner is allowed to eat meat and he's allowed to drink wine, so also he's allowed to bathe in cold water. Meisve, we have a kasha. Ina bogeris rasha lenavel esatzma bime evel avia. That if you have a girl who's more than 12 and a half years old, and already she has to be looking for a shidduch, so if she's in a velus, so she shouldn't, she should try to keep her appearance in tip-top shape so that she gets a good shidduch even when she's mourning. Hanaira Rasha, but a Naira who's 12, between the age of 12 and 12 and a half, who's not yet in shidduchim, so then she, she sort of can mourn regularly and doesn't need to worry about the shidduchim. So, my lab berchitza. Mistama, what we're saying is that the Bogeres is allowed to bathe. Uvemai, Ileim Bechamin. So if we're going to say that we're talking about hot water in a Bogeres Rasha, what do you mean that this girl is not allowed to make herself distraught, and instead she could bathe in hot water? But Rav Chisda says that a mourner is not allowed to put even a finger in hot water. So clearly we can't be saying that she's allowed to bathe in hot water. Rather, it must be talking about that she is allowed to bathe in cold water, but nobody else is. So Rava had said that an Ovel is allowed to bathe in cold water for all 7 days, but we seem to be saying that we make an exception for a Bogeres to be able to bathe in cold water, but nobody else is allowed to. So we say, Lo akichulu firkus. No, what that's talking about, she's allowed to wash her hair, she's allowed to put on makeup, things like that, but she wouldn't necessarily be able to bathe in cold water. No, I'm sorry. Meaning she's allowed to put on makeup and stuff like that, but nobody else is allowed to, right? But in terms of bathing, it doesn't necessarily imply anything about bathing. It's not talking about that, and therefore, Rava maintains that a mourner is allowed to bathe in cold water all 7 days, and we don't have anything to the contrary. Let's say that this taka supports Rava. Right? We saw this, like we saw a few lines ago, that the children of Rabbi Yossi, Reb Chanina passed away, and he taka bathed in cold water. So we see that supports Rava. Rava says that a mourner is allowed to bathe in cold water. And we see that Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina Dafka did that. So we say, well, that's talking about where, as we answered before, that was a unique situation where his children died one after the other, and he was in Avel for too long. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, that if he's in mourning one time after the next, if his hair becomes heavy, he's allowed to lighten it up with a razor, and he can also launder his clothing. Amr of Chizda, and says of Chizda, he's allowed to use a razor, but not scissors. He's allowed to use water, he's not allowed to use any kinds of detergents, and not ohol, which is also some kind of a plant which helps. All right, fine. So the fact that Rabbi Yosef Reb Chanina bathed in cold water while he was in Avel doesn't necessarily support Rava that a mourner is allowed to bathe in cold water, because he was a unique situation where his children had died one after the other. Those who say, Rava, says Rava, Avel osur b'tzonin kol shiva, that an Avel is not allowed to bathe in cold water, right? Just like Rav Chisda was saying. But why should that be any different than meat and wine? He's allowed to eat meat, he's allowed to drink wine. So why is he allowed to do that, yet he's not allowed to bathe in cold water? Well, because the meat and the wine thing, that's just to kind of like, chill out his fears, whatever, but bathing is a different thing. Let's say that this taka supports Rava, that a mourner is not allowed to bathe in cold water. In a Bogeres Vashal in Aval Atzma, we said that, well, a Bogeres, a girl who's 12 and a half years old plus, so she keeps herself presentable during Shiva. Hanaira Rasha, but a Naira who isn't in Shidduchim yet, so then she can sort of make herself distraught without having to worry about the Shadchonim. So b'mai ilem b'chamin, if we're going to say that, okay, a Bogeres is allowed to bathe in hot water, in a Bogeres Rasha, what do you mean that a Bogeres is not allowed to make herself distraught, and therefore she would be allowed to bathe in hot water? That an Ovel is not allowed to even put a finger in hot water. So rather, it must be talking about cold water. It's saying that a Bogeres Davka is allowed to bathe in cold water, but nobody else is. That's a support for Rava, who says that a mourner is not allowed to bathe in cold water. Lo, Akichul Firkus say no. What we're saying is that a Bogeres is allowed to put on makeup, is allowed to wash her hair, but it has nothing to do with bathing in cold water. So it's not a proof either way. Says of Chizda, so this teaches that an Ovel, right, a regular Ovel is not allowed to launder clothing. The halacha is, Ovel osur lirchotz kol gufo bein b'cham and bein b'tzorin. The halacha is that a mourner is not allowed to bathe his entire body whether in hot water, whether in cold water, kol shiva for the entirety of the 7 days of shiva. In terms of his face, his hands and his feet, he's allowed to wash them in cold water, but not hot water. But to sort of put oil on himself, so that's you can't even do that a little bit. But if it's to remove any bad smells, then it's okay. So friends, I think we're going to stop here. As I said, it's kind of high up on the daf, but if we don't stop here, it just kind of keeps on going for a while, and I think we'll just stop here. But friends, bring your A game tomorrow, because I think we're going to have a big page tomorrow. Okay, friends, well, that was daf Yud Gimel of Masechta Taanis. So really, for much of the daf, we kind of explored the opinion of Rafam Bar Papa, who says the name of Rav Chizda, that there's kind of two kinds of fast days. There's the fast days that are out of mourning, and the fast days that are out of we just don't want to get enjoyment. So if it's that we don't want to get enjoyment, so then you cannot bathe in hot water because that's enjoyable, but cold water is okay. If it's about mourning, so then you're not allowed to bathe whether in hot water or in cold water. Okay, then we saw kind of two ways to understand an opinion of Rava, which is also basically the first way we're saying actually that you are allowed to bathe in cold water as a mourner. The other opinion is that you are not, but we end up saying in the end that a mourner is not allowed to bathe his entire body, whether in cold water, whether in hot water. In terms of face, hands, and feet, that's allowed with cold water, but not with hot water. And in terms of anointing oil on one's body, you may not do it unless it is because there are bad smells that you want to remove, I guess like a deodorant kind of thing. Friends, that was Daf Yud Gimel, Masechta Taanis. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Peace out.